Introduction. Some monsters do not hunt alone. In the summer of 1979, Southern California became the stalking ground for two men whose cruelty defied imagination. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, names that even today send a ripple of unease through anyone who has studied true crime. Together they formed a pact, a shared fantasy forged behind prison walls, shaped by hatred and bloodlust. A fantasy they would soon bring to life with chilling precision. They didn't look like killers. Bittaker, the quiet, intelligent machinist with a sharp mind and dead eyes. Norris, the twitchy ex-con with a violent past and a desperate need for approval. Together they were predators. They built their hunting tool, a silver GMC van later dubbed Murder Mac. Inside, they outfitted it with everything they needed to abduct, torture, and kill. A mobile chamber of horrors, and they began to prowl. Their victims were young girls, innocent, unlucky enough to cross paths with two men who viewed human life as nothing more than a disposable toy. But Bittaker and Norris didn't just kill. They wanted to savor every scream, every broken plea, every shattered soul. They recorded the terror. They kept trophies, and even after their capture, the echoes of their crimes and the tapes, the testimonies, continued to haunt everyone who heard them. This is not just a story about murder. It's a story about two men who turned pain into a game, and how, for 5 young girls, a normal summer afternoon became the gateway to hell. Chapter 1. Twisted Paths Cross. In 1977, two broken men found themselves behind the same prison walls, and the fuse for unimaginable horror was lit. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were both inmates at the California men's colony in San Luis Obispo. On paper, they were just another pair of convicts among thousands. But under the surface, something darker stirred. Bittaker was already a career criminal. Intelligent but aimless, his crimes escalated from petty theft to violent assault. He wore the mask of politeness when it suited him, charming guards and fellow inmates with a calm, calculated demeanor. But behind the quiet smile there was rage, cold, methodical, and patient. Roy Norris was different, weaker, needier. A man with a history of sexual violence, always teetering between self-pity and explosive brutality. He was the kind of predator who looked for someone stronger to lead him. When they met, the connection was almost instant. In the yard, during long, idle conversations, their twisted fantasies surfaced. They spoke freely in a way they never had before. Not about escape, not about redemption, but about power, about domination, about inflicting pain. They discovered they shared the same dark hunger, young girls. And more than that, they dreamed of creating the perfect hunting partnership. A van, tools, a plan, they discussed every detail. How they would stalk their prey, how they would subdue them, how they would record their screams, not just for the moment, but to relive the terror whenever they wished. Inside prison walls, where words often meant nothing, their pact was born with chilling sincerity. When they were released, Norris first, then Bittaker, they kept in touch. They found each other again in the outside world, just as they had promised. Most men left prison hoping to rebuild their lives. Bittaker and Norris left with a mission: to build a nightmare on wheels, and to feed the hunger they had nursed for far too long. Chapter 2. The Silver Van. Every predator needs a hunting ground, and every hunter needs the right tools. For Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the weapon of choice wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a van. In early 1979, Bittaker purchased a silver 1977 GMC cargo van. No windows in the back, no markings. Plain, anonymous, a ghost on wheels. They called it Murder Mac. To the casual observer, it was just another work vehicle, the kind you'd see parked outside a construction site or idling in a grocery store lot. But inside, it was a rolling death trap. They stripped the back completely. No seats, no insulation, just cold, bare metal. They bolted a homemade wooden box to the floor, large enough to imprison a young girl out of sight. They stocked it with duct tape, rope, ice picks, pliers, and a variety of hand tools twisted from their intended purpose into instruments of terror. A sliding side door allowed them to pull victims inside quickly, minimizing the chance of being seen. They rehearsed, they practiced, at parks, shopping centers, high school parking lots, always watching, always learning. They didn't just build a van. They built a mobile hunting ground where they controlled every second, every movement, every scream. In Murder Mac, there would be no witnesses, no chance for escape. Only the cold steel confines of a van designed for capture, torture, and silence. The streets of Southern California teemed with life. Young girls laughing, walking home from school, believing they were safe. They weren't. Because somewhere nearby, hidden behind the glare of the sun off a silver van, two monsters waited, smiling, planning, patient. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 3. First Blood. On June 24, 1979, the plan became reality. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was just 16 years old, a bright, kind-hearted girl walking home after a church meeting in Torrance, California. Innocent, unaware. She never saw the van until it was too late. Bittaker and Norris spotted her from a distance. The timing was perfect. The sidewalk was empty, the street quiet under the fading summer light. They pulled alongside her. Norris slid open the side door. Lucinda didn't even have time to scream. In one fluid motion, they dragged her into the van. The door slammed shut behind her. The world outside disappeared. Inside Murder Mac, Lucinda struggled, fought, kicked. But it didn't matter. Bittaker drove calmly. Norris subdued her, wrapping duct tape over her mouth, binding her arms and legs with practiced ease. The first abduction had gone exactly as planned, but their fantasy wasn't about kidnapping. It was about what came next. They drove to the San Gabriel Mountains, isolated, empty, a place where no one would hear the things they were about to do. When they arrived, they dragged Lucinda from the van, her eyes wide with terror, her muffled cries lost in the mountain wind. They raped her, together, methodically. And when they were done, Bittaker took a clothes hanger, twisted into a makeshift garrote, and wrapped it around Lucinda's throat. He tightened it slowly, deliberately, drawing out her death as long as possible. Norris later said he turned away, not out of mercy, but because he couldn't bear how long it took for her to die. Bittaker took pleasure in it, every shudder, every fading heartbeat. When it was over, they wrapped Lucinda's body in a plastic shower curtain, stuffed her into the brush off a nearby fire road, and left her there like garbage. No ceremony, no remorse, just silence. On the drive back to civilization, they congratulated each other. They talked about improvements they could make for next time. Efficiency, technique. Killing Lucinda Schaefer hadn't satisfied them. It had awakened them. They weren't just fantasists anymore. They were predators, hunters, and their hunger had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Toolbox of Horror. After Lucinda Schaefer, the killings didn't stop. They evolved. Bittaker and Norris realized they didn't just crave the act of murder, they craved the process, the slow, deliberate infliction of pain. And so the van, Murder Mac, became more than a means to abduct. It became a mobile chamber of torment. Inside, they created their own toolbox of horror. Simple items twisted into weapons of agony, pliers, hammers, ice picks, screwdrivers, household tools, turned instruments of terror. They discovered that the simpler the tool, the greater the suffering, and they reveled in it. Each new abduction became an experiment. They would break their victims slowly, physically, mentally, spiritually. They would tape their mouths shut but leave their eyes wide open, forcing them to see every coming moment. Screams were not an inconvenience. They were the goal. And Bittaker, ever the technician, insisted on recording everything. He brought a small tape recorder into the van. As the girls screamed, begged, sobbed, he captured it all. Hours of audio, each second a monument to pain. In one recording, later uncovered by investigators, a girl's voice could be heard, pleading for her life, offering to do anything, promising to obey, sobbing as the sound of pliers working on her body echoed around her. The men didn't rush. They took their time, hammering, twisting, piercing, treating flesh like scrap metal. They often whispered encouragement to each other during the acts, cold, clinical suggestions on what to try next, as if they were mechanics fine-tuning an engine. Bittaker was always calm, precise. Norris was more impulsive, sometimes trembling with excitement, other times retreating into dark silence after the frenzy passed. But neither showed a flicker of remorse. The girls, Jacqueline Gilliam, Leah Lamp, and others, were not just victims, they were projects, playthings, objects. Their bodies were found, when they were found at all, broken almost beyond recognition, crushed skulls, punctured lungs, bones shattered by hammer blows, and those who listened to the tapes afterward. Even the most hardened detectives, men who had seen death 100 times over, couldn't make it through without breaking down. Some investigators had to leave the room. Some wept openly. One suffered a nervous breakdown, because the screams recorded inside Murder Mac were not just sounds. They were proof that monsters are real, that they wear human faces, that sometimes when the door slides closed behind you, there is no salvation coming, only the slow surgical destruction of everything you are. And for Bittaker and Norris, it was never enough. There was always room for more screams, more blood, more silence afterward. Chapter 5. The victim list grows. After the death of Lucinda Schaefer, something inside Bittaker and Norris shifted. The fear that had clung to their first kill evaporated, replaced by something darker, something hungry. They realized they could get away with it, and that realization unleashed them completely. Their next target came just 2 weeks later. Andrea Hall, 18 years old, full of life, working a summer job as a waitress. She was hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway when the silver van pulled over. Inside Murder Mac, Andrea's fate was sealed before she even stepped off the curb. They pulled her inside, bound her, gagged her, and drove into the mountains once again, their private hunting ground. Andrea fought harder than Lucinda had. She begged, she reasoned, she screamed. It only made them more excited. Bittaker forced her to pose for Polaroids at knife point, smiling, crying, stripped of dignity, one photo at a time. When they were finished with her body, when the screaming stopped, they drove a screwdriver through her skull, twice, and left her broken body among the rocks, forgotten by everyone except them. But they weren't done. Less than 2 months later, they struck again. On September 3rd, 1979, Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp, two young girls just 15 and 13 years old, were sitting on a curb outside a shopping center waiting for a ride that would never come. The silver van approached. The side door slid open. It was too late. Jackie and Leah endured the worst of it. Held captive for 2 days inside Murder Mac, tortured relentlessly. Every new method they had devised was tested on the girls. They recorded everything, every scream, every plea, every whimper. They drilled ice picks into skulls. They crushed bones with pliers. They tore innocents apart with the cold, detached efficiency of men who believed they would never be caught. Jackie and Leah died slowly and horribly. Bittaker and Norris discarded their bodies in the same canyons where they'd thrown the others. The mountains slowly becoming a graveyard built on their arrogance. Each successful kill emboldened them further. They began to cruise more often. Middle schools, malls, bus stops, any place where vulnerability lingered in the summer heat. They talked openly between themselves about perfecting their technique, ways to extend the suffering, ways to make the death last longer. There was no remorse, only logistics. By the end of September 1979, Bittaker and Norris believed they were invincible. They were hunters in an endless field of prey. And as the months wore on, the van rolled through the streets of Southern California like a phantom, silent, patient, unstoppable, until one mistake changed everything. Chapter 6: A Fatal Mistake. Arrogance is a slow poison, and for Bittaker and Norris it had seeped into their blood. By the fall of 1979, they believed they were untouchable, invisible hunters immune to the rules of the world they preyed upon. But no one stays invisible forever. Their fatal mistake wasn't sloppy evidence. It wasn't a misstep at a crime scene. It was a loose tongue. Roy Norris had always been the weaker of the two. Eager for approval, desperate for validation, and one night, feeling invincible, he began to brag. To an old prison buddy named Joseph Jackson, he started telling stories. Stories about girls, about screams, about death. At first, Jackson thought it was just drunken bravado, prison talk, designed to sound tough. But as Norris described the details, the van, the mountains, the tools, something cold crawled down Jackson's spine. He realized Norris wasn't boasting. He was confessing. Jackson went to the police immediately, and the quiet machinery of justice began to turn. Investigators started looking at Bittaker and Norris hard. They found that Bittaker had been arrested numerous times before, mostly minor offenses, but enough to paint a picture. And Norris had a history darker than most people realized, including prior convictions for sexual assault. Piece by piece, a hidden world of horror came into view. Still, they needed more. A confession, something concrete. The police arranged for Joseph Jackson to meet with Norris again, this time wearing a wire. And Norris, drunk on his own perceived invincibility, talked. He spoke openly about Murder Mac, about the girls, about what they had done. The words spilled out like sewage, and the tape recorder captured every foul detail. It was enough to finally break through the thin facade they had built. On November 20th, 1979, both Bittaker and Norris were arrested. The silver van, Murder Mac, was seized. Inside, investigators found the tools, the restraints, the bloodstains, and worse, a cache of Polaroids, souvenirs of agony. But the most devastating evidence came when Norris, faced with a lifetime behind bars, turned on his partner. In exchange for a plea deal, he told everything, every abduction, every rape, every murder. He led detectives to the shallow graves. He described the screams, the suffering, the final moments of girls whose only mistake was trusting the wrong stranger. The invincible predators had fallen. Not through a high-speed chase, not through forensic genius, but through their own rotting pride. They believed they were smarter than the world. They weren't. And now, the world would finally know what hid behind the doors of the silver van. Chapter 7. The Arrest and the Tapes. When the police raided Bittaker's motel room and Norris's apartment, they expected evidence. They were not prepared for what they found. Inside Murder Mac, they uncovered the physical remnants of terror. Pliers caked with old blood, ice picks stained and bent, hammers dulled from repeated use. There were restraints bolted to the walls. There were stains on the van floor that no amount of scrubbing could erase. But the worst was yet to come. In a battered locker rented by Bittaker at a local storage facility, detectives discovered a box. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them, girls, some smiling awkwardly, unaware of the hell waiting for them. Others mid-scream, eyes wide with animal terror, faces contorted in agony. Each photograph was another confession, another frozen moment of horror. And then they found the tapes. At first they didn't know what they were. Unlabeled cassette tapes thrown carelessly into a shoebox. One officer played a tape out of morbid curiosity. What he heard shattered him. The voice of a girl, barely more than a child, pleading for mercy, her words choked by sobs. The cold, mocking voices of Bittaker and Norris in the background, encouraging each other, laughing, relishing every broken plea. The tape didn't just record violence. It recorded the systematic dismantling of a human being. Detectives, hardened men who had seen every form of depravity, broke down listening to it. Some officers vomited. Others wept openly. A few had to leave the room unable to finish. The horror on the tapes was beyond imagination. It was methodical, clinical, a perfect record of suffering preserved forever on magnetic tape. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, the tools, the taped confessions, every piece fit together to form a picture of evil so complete, so monstrous that even seasoned prosecutors struggled to comprehend it. Bittaker, ever arrogant, believed he could talk his way out of it. He smiled through interrogations. He denied everything, even as the mountain of evidence grew around him. Norris, broken and desperate for survival, gave the police detailed statements. He described the girls, named names, led officers to shallow graves where decomposed remains told the final silent chapters of lives cut short. By the end of the investigation, the full scale of the nightmare was clear. 5 confirmed victims, dozens more suspected. Each young life extinguished under the steel shell of a silver van. And now the world would see the monsters for what they truly were. Not ghosts, not myths, but men. Breathing, laughing men who had walked among the innocent, hiding their horror behind a calm smile and a sliding van door. Chapter 8. Justice and Aftermath. Justice, when it finally came, felt hollow. Roy Norris was the first to fold. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, he agreed to a plea deal. He pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and testified against Lawrence Bittaker in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It was a coward's bargain, trading lives for his own. But his testimony was crucial. At Bittaker's trial in 1981, prosecutors laid out the horror piece by piece. The Polaroids, the tools, the tapes. Jurors were forced to listen to parts of the recording. A girl screaming, sobbing, begging for her life while Bittaker and Norris laughed. Several jurors wept openly. Others sat rigid, pale, gripping their seats so hard their knuckles turned white. The evidence was so overwhelming, so monstrous, that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts, for the murder of Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Leah Lamp, and Shirley Ledford, their final victim, whose death was recorded in the most horrifying detail. Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death. But death would not come quickly. He spent decades on death row at San Quentin State Prison, filing appeal after appeal, manipulating the system, refusing to show remorse. He died of natural causes in 2019, a peaceful death, something he had denied every one of his victims. Roy Norris spent the rest of his life behind bars, a shadow of the man who once laughed as girls screamed. He died in 2020, alone and forgotten. But the damage they caused, it never truly ended. Families shattered, communities scarred. The officers who listened to the tapes, some never returned to the force. Some drank themselves into oblivion. Some carried the screams with them into every sleepless night. The Toolbox killers left more than bodies behind. They left ghosts, invisible wounds carved into the hearts of everyone who touched the case. And even now, if you listen carefully on a lonely stretch of California highway, you might feel it, the weight of all those stolen lives. The memory of a silver van rolling slowly along the curb, its door sliding open, a hand reaching out from the dark, and the echo of a scream, cut short but never truly silenced. Some stories leave you cold, others leave you hollow, but the story of the Toolbox killers, it leaves a permanent scar. Not just because of the brutality, not just because of the lives stolen, but because it reminds us of a terrible truth. That monsters do not live under our beds. They walk among us, smile at us, wait for the right moment to strike, and sometimes they ride in a silver van, rolling down a street where someone innocent, is just trying to get home. Thank you for walking through this darkness with me. It's not easy, but it's necessary, because remembering is a kind of justice too. If you felt the weight of this story, if you believe stories like this should be told with care and truth, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps bring these stories to life faster and lets us continue to dive even deeper into the shadows, to tell them the way they deserve to be told. Thank you for staying with me until the end. See you in the next story. And until then, stay safe. Stay aware.